Olá, boa tarde a todos e todas. Meio-dia agora, começo pedindo desculpas pela confusão que nosso erro, nós fizemos um erro com relação ao fuso horário do professor Panitch. Então, peço desculpas a todos e todas pelo atraso desse início, mas fico muito feliz, ainda assim, de ter podido estar aqui com vocês e estar aqui com os meus colegas e o professor Leo Panitch, nesse momento tão importante, e tão confuso para todos nós. Então, boa tarde e bem-vindos e bem-vindas. Estou começando a falar em português, para daqui a pouquinho passar para o inglês, para explicar algumas coisinhas breves, Bom, eu sou Ana Garcia, quem não me conhece, sou professora do Instituto de Relações Internacionais da PUC-Rio, faço parte da coordenação da rede RI Marxismo. Estou aqui com vocês hoje com dois outros colegas também participantes da rede, professores que já vão se apresentar. Então, eu queria também começar já agradecendo ao Instituto de Relações Internacionais da PUC-Rio, ao RIMA, por estar promovendo esse evento, e ao podcast Chutando a Escada também, pela copromoção dessa atividade. Vou dar, então, as boas-vindas aos meus colegas e explicar a nossa dinâmica, tá bom? Débora, boa tarde, Filipe, como estão?
Olá, boa tarde a todos e todas, é uma alegria estar aqui. Para quem não me conhece, sou o Filipe, professor de Relações Internacionais da Federal de Uberlândia e um dos co-hosts aí do podcast Chutando a Escada, que é um podcast que fala de política internacional. Professor Panitch, thank you very much for having us. It's a great pleasure to have you here in a peaceful and calm day. We'll try to understand U.S. politics. Thank you very much.
I'm happy to be here.
Eu sou Debora Gaspar, sou professora de Relações Internacionais na Universidade Federal Rural do Rio de Janeiro e também queria cumprimentar o professor. We are thrilled to have you here with us today, Professor.
Thank you, Deborah.
Leo, before coming to you, let me just explain to the public the dynamics. I'll be doing this in Portuguese and then we'll switch to English very soon. Pessoal, a nossa intenção com essa atividade, com o professor Panitch, é fazer uma dinâmica de perguntas, que ele possa comentar, responder e entrar um pouco em algumas das temáticas que nos parecem importantes hoje. Então, eu, Débora e Filipe preparamos algumas questões, mas, evidentemente, conhecendo a qualidade do público que está aqui conosco, fiquem à vontade de colocar as questões no chat, que nós vamos tentar agrupá-las e trazê-las também para essa forma de entrevista, que nós vamos fazer. E a outra questão é a seguinte: nós não temos como financiar uma tradução simultânea, então decidimos fazer assim mesmo em inglês, sabendo das limitações que isso significa para o público brasileiro, mas estamos nos comprometendo aqui com todos, depois que terminar essa live, que vai durar mais ou menos 1 hora, portanto, mais ou menos até a 1h, nós vamos fazer a edição e colocar as legendas para que possa ficar disponível ao público, tá? Okay, Leo, so thank you very, very much. I know it's going to be a busy day for you today, and probably the whole week has been very busy, and I know that this is an important time, especially for you as an expert and specialist in U.S. politics and all that matters along this election. I'll introduce you very quickly. Professor Panitch is a distinguished research professor of political science and Canada Research Chair of Comparative Politics at York University. Panitch has focused his academic research in writing on the spread of global capitalism, American empire, globalization. He is one of the editors of Socialist Register. He's an author of more than 100 articles and 9 books. And Panitch has inspired many Marxists across the world and here in Brazil. So thank you very, very much. So Leo, to start with, our main concern to talk to you about is to try to grasp the deeper processes that are going on within the United States, and which affect, of course, the whole world. So more or less how global capitalism is being or not reshaped by these inner and deeper processes that are going on within the United States right now, or for the last years. So we would like to start with the political, economic, and social crisis that is going on right now that we can see in this election. Much has been said and read about the word polarization. I think this is an important issue for everybody. So on the one hand, Trumpism, the far-right groups, violent groups, militias. On the other hand, you could say the other, very other side of the coin, the Sanders campaign, Black Lives Matter movements, etc. So having what we have so far in the election results, how do we evaluate these results in terms of the deeper social processes that are taking place in the United States? What does it mean, or what could it mean in the near future for the American political environment in terms of political parties or any change in that, social movements, unions, etc.? Do you see what you once called the American domestic social decay and the popular anxieties reflected in these results now? So how to better understand them in terms of the deeper processes that are going on in the last years?
Well, you know, in the 1930s, I think it was Adorno who said, "He who speaks of fascism and does not speak of capitalism should remain silent." And I've been saying for some years now that he who speaks of capitalism in the 21st century and does not speak of fascism should remain silent. It seems to be the case, and obviously you see this in Brazil very clearly, that the longer capitalism continues to exist, the longer that socialists are unable to replace it with something humane and democratic, egalitarian, that the likelihood is that fascism will gain more and more ground in a capitalist framework in the 21st century. And that's what you're seeing at the very heart of global capitalism in the United States today. Of course, we've seen tendencies like this not only in Brazil, but in Western Europe, in India, but it happening in the United States is obviously very significant. And it's very interesting in terms of you putting this in terms of the growth of polarization, that this is happening just in the wake of the world having become capitalist at its core, that is in social relations between all human beings, right across the globe by the beginning of the 21st century. For the first time in history, really, you would have to say that the whole world became capitalist. And yet at the same time, inside each of the states that fostered this unanimity of capitalism, this oneness of capitalism around the world, within those states, the polarizations have exploded. Obviously, in terms of class inequalities, built on some decades of the repression of trade unionism, but also, obviously, the changes in the labor force that a global capitalism encouraged, and a continued fragmentation of old working class communities, a deformation of the working class, if you like. And inside those countries, you not only see a growing class polarization in wealth and income inequality, but you also see an explosion of polarizations around identities. And most visibly in the United States, of course, but not only. not only because globalization has been accompanied inevitably by a migration crisis around the globe. And that was felt very strongly in the United States as Central American and Mexican migrants were pulled into the American labor market to do things like water the golf courses of the Trump Corporation. But at the same time, of course, they were pushed out by the appalling conditions in the countries they came from, whether induced by external war or more likely induced by internal wars. So you've seen a polarization of identities. In the American case, it inevitably takes the form of the legacy of slavery. To some extent, that's true in Brazil, and its continuing effects, not least in the terms of the ways it divides the working class. And while Black Lives Matter, for instance, is a very important development in relation to police oppression and very important for calling for a restructuring of the local state apparatus around police, not just changing policy, but actually reorganizing the apparatus. That's very important. But behind this, the leadership of Black Lives Matter is very much an equality of opportunity approach to the inequalities and polarization. You know, it is a upward mobility. There should be as many Black CEOs as there are white CEOs, proportionate to the population. And that doesn't resolve the fundamental problem of inequality. So this has created space for the growth, they're not new, for the growth of these explicitly fascist, racist, xenophobic militias who are very significant on the ground, especially in the current moment. Trump learned how to speak to them. To some extent, his whole persona sometimes always reflected them. And he has, if anything, increased his support in this election. Certainly, he's increased the number of votes he's got, although the number of total votes went up. This is very regionally divided. But even in California or in New York, what is really significant in terms of the fascist threat is that Trump, even there, was getting 35%, is getting 35% of the vote. Imagine that, a third of the population voting for this. So these polarizations are very, very significant. And there is a distrust of the old ruling class in a very large portion of the population. And the fact that a majority of them, or near a majority, say that they support Trump on not only a majority, sometimes much more than that, sometimes as much as 75%, on the economy, one has to say, what is that a signifier of? Is it for them that the stock market does well, the economy does well? Is it that before the virus, there was low unemployment in the United States, usually in very shitty and insecure jobs, but still? Or is it rather that this is a buzzword in a crude way for private property? And that what people were really hearing, and certainly in Miami, this is what those who escaped leftist governments in Latin America were hearing. When they hear the economy, they hear private property. They hear their own wealth. And they were astonishingly open to the claim that Joe Biden is a socialist. And the most dangerous indication of the growth of fascism is the charge that socialism is a great force in the country. And you get, therefore, a reaction from the anti-socialist forces that Mussolini and Hitler represented so well, if you like. in their own terms, so horribly in our terms. This raises the stakes insofar as the Sanders, well, beginning with Occupy, but then the Sanders campaign pulled so many tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of young people into politics, moved them from protests like Occupy to actually trying to get into the state, built a certain infrastructure like the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, which, before Sanders had, I think, 5,000 members with an average age, I'm ashamed to say, as old as mine. It now has 60,000 members with an average age of under 30. So that's a wonderful thing, and I think it bodes well for the future, insofar as those people can turn themselves into organizers, into engaging in class formation again, with a working class that is so deformed, if you like, that can throw itself into the labor movement in a way that would change the decrepit bureaucratic unions. Not all of them, of course. The teachers, the nurses are a very new and dynamic type of unionism, but most aren't. And that's the sine qua non for building a left which is capable of taking this on. But as it becomes more capable, that does raise the stakes in the face of these fascist tendencies. So this is what we need to be looking for internally in the United States, but obviously not only in the United States, in your own country as well.
Thanks so much, Leo. We'll go back to it. If you have time in the end, I'll give the word to Debora to go on with some of the other questions.
Thanks for that, sir. So I'd like to pick up from that and exploring the concept of American informal, developed together with Sam Gindin, which we all here consider highly useful to make sense of the determinants, both internal and external, to the construction of an US-led globalized capitalism. Narrow this a bit further. So back in 2019, you didn't relate Trumpism to deglobalization by showing data on foreign direct investment, trade, and so on. Today, the world is facing a very deep crisis, especially due to the pandemic, which is very unique in its nature, especially if we compare it with the mostly, let's say, North Atlantic financial turmoil of 2008-09. So my question is, does the crisis disorganize by any means the material and ideal foundations of the American informal empire, in your point of view?
Yes, obviously. You're referring to a lead essay in the Socialist Register that Sam Gindin and I wrote in 2019 called Trumping the Empire. I think one has to take a step back and get a theoretical handle on this in international political economy terms. You'll recall that when the word globalization became a buzzword in academic life in the 1890s, early 1890s, everybody was using it in the sense of capital having bypassed states, having escaped states. That is now, for those people, embarrassingly wrong. Has been for a long time. It's absurd. It was absurd then, and now it's patently absurd. Free trade agreements were not done between corporations, they were done between states. It was states who were the authors of globalization. And it needed a lot of regulation to make happen, which is what the free trade agreements were about, and many other international agreements. So at that time, the balance of forces politically was such in the leading capitalist states, including what has become one, the Chinese, as to support, facilitate help manage the contradictions of the transnational mobility of capital and the treating of foreign capital the same as domestic capital as far as possible inside of each of the individual states. It doesn't mean they weren't supporting their multinational corporations. They were, but they also were committing themselves domestically to treat foreign capital there in their own country the same as domestic capital. Now, at the same time, one has to say, there was another theorization going on, built out of the Marxist theory of imperialism, although it had certain conventional IR legacies as well. And that was, and Arrighi represented this best and most profoundly, Giovanni Arrighi, that the world history is best told through the rise and fall of empires. And in Arrighi's understanding, and he was a great political economist, financial capital had to be seen in relation to those empires as central to the rise and fall of empire. So you had a long tradition in the Marxist theoretical heritage of inter-imperial rivalry, which was being revived. And then a lot of conventional IR, international relations theorists, of course, as you know so well, they never look inside states. They see the world as a billiard table with states as balls bouncing off of each other. And you develop a strategy for how they are best to bounce off of each other, since they mainly want to give advice to governments. And it seems to me that it seemed to me then, and it seems to be proven to all the more now, that the main polarizations, contradictions, conflicts internationally do not lie in this global capitalism we've now got, so much between states as within states. Insofar as globalization is being challenged and undermined, it's due to polarities, contradictions, conflicts within states much more than between them. They, of course, will then use the forces that are thrown up by the domestic forces opposed to globalization. They will try to undo some of the international connections, whether that is the German right or the Italian right in the European Union, or whether that is the Trumpist forces inside the United States, which has now spilled over and was already somewhat being played with by the Democrats before Trump, of making China the bogeyman. In fact, there has been very, very little deglobalization. In fact, almost none. When you look at the amount of capital flowing around the world, when you look at the effect of the American tariffs on the amount of trade, the United States has a higher trade deficit with China now than it did before Trump introduced the tariffs. Certainly in terms of financial integration, the Chinese have been more open to financial integration, and Wall Street more determined to get it during the last 3-4 years than ever. Wall Street desperately wants to be able to make money off of the enormous accumulation of capital inside China. And people there are either buying state bonds or keeping their money in cash accounts. There is no money market in China to speak of. And they have opened up. Right at the beginning of the pandemic, on April 1st, JP Morgan spent $1 billion taking advantage of a new provision, a new regulation the Chinese had introduced, that allow American financial firms to own more than 50%, and indeed all of, a Chinese financial firm. Moreover, even though there have been interruptions in trade in the face of the pandemic, you also see at the same time the extent to which it has been Chinese firms that have fueled the provision of protective equipment, or emergency protective equipment. So I don't see in any sense that there's been deglobalization. It's not easy for Apple to overnight switch those components that are produced abroad generally in China very deeply, often by Taiwanese firms, ironically, or Japanese firms. There has been some switch of production to Vietnam, etc., because of lower wages. But in terms of the main trends, we are not seeing a globalization, in fact. And I don't think someone like Trump wants one. I mean, after all, he really what he wants to do is to be able to build Trump towers in Beijing and Shanghai, or indeed in every city with over 1 million in China, and you know how many of those there are. So no, it's not a matter of deglobalization, but the fact that states had to legitimate themselves over the last 30, 40 years as they fostered globalization by saying this was in the national interest, which they all did, means that a tremendous ideological and political and discursive contradiction developed. As more and more people felt themselves the victims of globalization, or were motivated by xenophobic or racist attitudes against migrants, the more they were able to use the legitimation of nationalism, the national interest, to build support of a rhetorical, ideological kind against globalization. We can see from Trump, and I think Bolsonaro, that this does not mean that they will pull out of global capitalism. Far from it, right? And there's not a lot of evidence that even the capitalists who support them would allow them to do so, let alone a very large number of capitalists who don't support them. Fascism is a cross-class phenomenon. It always has been. It's taking a different form today, but it always has been. But I do think that the fact that states were so important in the making of globalization means that it is the class conflicts, the social conflicts within states that matter, rather than the inter-imperial rivalry. Not the rise of China, which has produced deglobalization. Not at all. It's internal conflicts within those states.
I would like to bring this theoretical discussion to the U.S. politics, to the U.S. domestic politics. And deglobalization is not reality. You just said that. Trump used to say that he will bring American first, but America is not alone. America depends on international economy and so on. Trump is not, so he is isolationist in this sense. He may be other thing. He may be a nationalist with fascist strategies, with support of militias, as you were saying, in a time that capitalism is the core stone of the world. So I would like to ask you about that, about the role of cosmopolitanism and nationalism inside U.S. In many of your works, you sustain that cosmopolitanism, exemplified by Democrats such as Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and now Joe Biden, they were necessary to sustain the US informal empire. On the other hand, this presidential race has shown us that Trumpism, with its fascist strategies and so on, is a strong or maybe a permanent social force inside US society. You have also identified Trumpism as a phenomenon which is broader than Trump himself. So what's your view about the role and about the impacts of Trumpism for the US informal empire?
Yeah. Thank you, Filipe. That was the central theme of the Trumping the Empire essay in the Socialist Register in 2019. Yes, I think that's where we now have to take this. Even the cosmopolitanism of the Clintons or Robert Rubin at the Treasury, et cetera, who epitomize this mostly. You need to remember, first of all, that, as I said before, they were engaged in a contradictory thing, because they were at the same time saying that this is all in the national interest. And they were still full of the bullshit of the American dream in their politics. In fact, Clinton was seen as the black president because he spouted that bullshit most with regard to Black Americans. But you're absolutely right that the central thesis of our Making of Global Capitalism book was that for very specific historical reasons, there was no abstract theoretical answer to this. For very specific historical reasons, the United States came to play the central role in the making of global capitalism. In all of the things I said nation states were doing in my answer to the earlier question. This internationalization of states was most represented in the American state. And when I say the international states, I don't mean the formation of the European Union, or much less the United Nations, or what have you. I mean rather that actual states took it upon themselves the responsibility to not only manage their domestic economies and facilitate capital accumulation within them, but took it upon themselves to manage the contradictions, the irrationalities, the crisis-ridden tendencies of international capitalism. And that when they introduced domestic policies, they always did it with an eye to how much does that contribute to managing international capitalism, global capitalism. In that sense, they were genuinely cosmopolitan, if you like. Certainly this notion, this theory of the internationalization of the state should be, I immodestly think, a building block for understanding the 21st century and the contradictions in the 21st century. So what we've seen under Trump is a denuding of the institutions of the American state that do this. Above all, the American State Department and the American Treasury. The American Treasury was essentially the executive secretary of the G7. It brought that organization into being in the 1970s after Bretton Woods collapsed at the height of the dollar crisis, which was itself merely a reflection of the movement of capital without regulation around the world already in the 1960s. And it was also the executive secretary, the creator of the G20. And at the height of the 2007-8 financial crisis, it was the George Bush administration which brought the heads of state of the G20 together and signed on to a statement that has been reissued every year by the heads of the G20, saying that they pledged themselves in the face of this third great global crisis of capitalism, the greatest since the Depression, that they would not revert to the policies of the 1930s, that they maintain their commitment to free trade, free capital movements, etc. Trump has obviously not played that role. To put it mildly, the American Treasury has neither an interest nor a capacity to do so. This is the most important and significant indicator of the American state's loss of capacity to play that crucial role that no other state plays. And the Chinese keep saying, far from these people who say China is a threat to the United States, they want to remove it from it, they want the renminbi as the goal. It's such ridiculous notions. The Chinese keep calling for the American state to play a responsible role in the world. Okay, so on the other hand, and here's a great irony, especially for those of you in Brazil who've watched independent central banking so closely. You know, the term independent central banking, what does independent mean? It means independent from elected governments. That the pressure you get from independent governments to give a priority to high employment rather than inflation, they would be free of. In that sense, free of bourgeois democracy. Well, the independence of the Federal Reserve, which more than ever in this crisis, not only in 2007-8, but in this pandemic crisis, has proved itself to be the banker of the world. It is the World Bank. The Federal Reserve has acted in a functional way to the reproduction of global capitalism. It did so with great alacrity by March 2020. Of course, it was looking at were American banking and credit institutions going to remain viable. But at the very same time, insofar as they were looking at that, they were well aware that any unviability would bring down Europe's banks, which were in much weaker shape than the American banks because of the amount of regulation the Fed had done between 2010 and 2020. So the Fed has acted in an incredibly representative way of the internationalization of the state. And what is somewhat interesting is that always this used to be hidden from the American people. It was one of the contradictions, the most visible contradiction. And we wrote about this in the book of the American sponsorship of globalization, that when the Treasury and the Fed organized the bailout of Mexico during the peso crisis in 1994, they tried to hide it from Congress. They didn't want Congress to be able to say, what are you doing lending money, our taxpayers' money, to a Mexican banking system? Of course, they were only lending it to them so they could pay off Wall Street, right? And it was a Democratic majority Congress then. So this isn't just a Republican thing. And then in 97, 98, they did the same thing. Of course, they had to do everything they could both times to try to get the Germans, who are the least oriented to internationalization of the state, despite the EU, that they would agree to this. They were always the recalcitrant on the G7 to contributing to this. So what you see is the Fed, not the Treasury, although the Treasury is not vetoing it, which is significant, playing this role in the current pandemic. And you know what? Being somewhat less cagey about saying so, which is interesting. It's kind of like at the same time you get all of this nationalism, you also, people seem to run on two tracks. They've come to accept that the Fed will play this international role. And it shows you the extent to which the nationalism is not about deglobalizing, because I think that they see that this is essential, even if they're thinking of what the economy is in terms of their pensions. You know, they know enough to know that what the stock market is reflecting is also the ownership of Ale by American hedge funds, not the ownership, but investments in it. In any case, what I do think is that the crucial thing to look at is how the American state is losing the capacity to manage an increasingly unmanageable global capitalism. That is the crucial thing to look for. You're absolutely right, Filipe. That said, it is not completely undone by any means. If it does become more and more undone, the dangers then are of a greater and greater reliance on the authoritarian aspects of the American state, including the military and the security apparatus. That I think is the case with all of the mess that military and security apparatus has made of so much of the world. Yeah, above all, the Middle East, obviously. So that isn't a solution either. But it does, it gives, unless there are socialist forces who are going to, in 10 years, be able to really provide a long-term strategic alternative. I keep thinking of Adorno saying to Kafka, "Is there any hope?" And Kafka saying, "Of course there is, but not for us."
Leo, thank you. Let's have a few more questions if you have time. We have about 20 minutes left, if it's okay to you. Debora, do you want to go on? We would like to touch the subject of China a little bit, which crosses two things. One, what you just said about how capitalism is manageable or not, and how will the US and China relations will look like in the next period, and then go back to the issue of nationalism, xenophobia, and the far right globally. Debora, do you want to go on the first part of the...
Yes, if I could complete on that. We were talking yesterday about the rise of China, its consequences on employment all over the world, and the fact that China is occupying global governance positions. But what really we were really trying to grasp was, from the point of view of the left forces in the US, how could organize and fight for better employment conditions, or I'd say even environmental justice, without placing China as a threat, because this actually works. And then would be, is there a non-nationalist or at least a non-xenophobic approach when dealing with China for the American working classes, at least for foreseeable future?
Okay.
And in that question, Leo, just to complement Debora, what we're discussing, and you've already said that in other interviews, the topic of China is a bipartisan theme, both for Democrats and Trump. So whether Biden gets it now, the rise of China will continue to be represented as a threat, either a geopolitical threat or a threat to the employment of American workers. So how to better understand that?
Okay, let's get the first couple of things straight first. The restructuring of American manufacturing industry does not begin when China, with American agreement, after they had resisted it for so long. The American agreement came under enormous pressure from the American capitalist class, especially Wall Street. That restructuring of American industry does not begin with China's admission to the WTO in 2001. The restructuring of American industry begins in the 1980s with the way in which the dollar crisis, the profitability crisis of the 1970s was resolved, which is the massive unemployment that the Volcker shock introduced, the forcing of bailed out auto companies to reopen their contracts and reduce workers' wages and benefits, and the movement of the American auto industry increasingly from the cities of the Northeast to the southern United States, first of all, and even rural Ohio or Pennsylvania. So that restructuring, which does so much to change the capacity of the American working class, long predates China. And you know, when they're moving to factories in the South, where do you think they're moving? They're moving to factories that are owned by German and Japanese companies, which are treated the same as American capital, and indeed are induced by subsidies from those southern states. So no, this cannot be explained now in terms of the sudden emergence of China. No doubt, what makes the making of globalization viable for a period is that the Chinese very cheap products, or the Chinese components that cheapens products, from the jeans that people wear to that are imported by Walmart and used then to drive a small clothing manufacturer or retail outlet out of business, often in those small rural areas. That does mean that the American worker can reproduce herself or himself, reproduce their standard of living, even though they have suffered such a relative wage decline, because their jeans are cheaper, because the cell phone becomes cheaper. So, you know, one needs to see this as an integrated whole. People who speak of the China shock, this is all China, are not getting it. They aren't putting it in terms of where China fits in the history of this, and in what aspects it fits. It fits least in terms of the internationalization of financial capital, as I was speaking to before. And in that sense, the forces that will continue to promote a further integration with China will be very powerful. And that's the sense in which Biden will use his rhetoric against China in order to facilitate more and more the opening up of financial services in China to be run and a profit made out of, a surplus made out of it by foreign financial firms, not only American, obviously, but many American. So that's how I see this. Now, the very important strategic question that Debora posed. Look, if we are really socialists, there is nothing wrong with the word protection. What else should a socialist government do but protect its working people? We are not globalizers. We are not capitalist globalizers. We do want to find a way out of capitalist globalization. We do want more inward-oriented economic development. We want more planned investment. There's no conceivable way of dealing with the scale of the environmental crisis without economic planning. It's absolutely inconceivable. And the way in which states have been internationalized, they've been internationalized to facilitate the competition of capital. not democratic control over investment. So we are looking for a way to deglobalize, but to do so in a non-xenophobic, non-racist way. So I can totally envisage a demand for democratic economic planning in Brazil, led around the ending of export agriculture as the top priority, to feeding over 300 million people in a balanced way. Right? I can easily imagine calling for democratic economic planning in the United States or in Canada in a way that is oriented to shifting investment towards more domestic production in a more balanced way, and above all to radically balance environmental supportive production. We would need to do this in a way that doesn't target an enemy. That's the cheap way of doing it. We would be needing to do it by building on, yes, the emptiness in many respects of the Paris Accord, but building on the norms that it legitimates, at least. To say we want to be doing this in conjunction with China, helping it overcome its own contradictions, because there's appalling income and wealth polarization in China. And its own planning capacity is being, even in capitalist terms, is being challenged. So we want to do it in conjunction with other countries. It's not going to be done overnight, obviously. You have to be able to rebuild the factories to produce jeans again in the United States, right? But we can do it, I think, in a way that says we will be committed to doing this. We will take steps towards doing it. And we will try to learn from you as we do it. And we will try to do it in a way that builds support for us. That's all more easily said than done. But I see no other way forward. Not only is the socialist left, but for humanity in the 21st century.
Professor, I would like to bring the conversation to Brazilian politics. We have here with us many viewers here in our YouTube channel. Thank you very much, guys, for being here with us. Our colleague, Regiane Carol, she's here asking you about, in your view, she's asking how much the internationalization of the far right can be affected by this possible Trump's defeat. And I would like to go a little bit further. Here in Brazil, it's clear how Trump has inspired far-right leaders such as Bolsonaro and his family, and many other Brazilian political forces. Here we've seen people calling for riots here in Brazil to stand up for Trump. It's something that doesn't make any sense for me. Our foreign minister, Ernesto Araújo, has a automatic political alignment with Trump. It is something unbelievable. Anyway, in your view, how do you understand the role and the impacts of Trumpism for other far-right forces in the world, in this, especially now, in this presidential race? And if I may, we have a second question here from our viewers, since we are talking about Brazil. Professor Maldonado, he's here with us. He's asking you about what, in your view, would be Biden's foreign policy for Latin America.
I'm not an expert on this, and I must get off at 11. I have a call from my doctor coming in. I'd only say that the reverberations at a popular level worry me as much or more than the links between Trump and Bolsonaro at a more personal level. when I saw demonstrations in Germany with demonstrators carrying QAnon signs. This struck me as far more significant than those personal relations. I do think that if Bolsonaro clings to power, that Trump will be playing a role in supporting him, whether he's president or not. He will be a trumpet for Bolsonaro in office or out of office. I think that Biden will try to deepen the connections between capitalist America and Latin America, South America, as much as Trump will. But more than this, I really, not least because I'm running out of time, I'm afraid, can't answer these very good questions.
Leo, thank you very much. We really, really appreciate that. It was very, inspiring and illuminating some of the confusions and things that were not clear. We thank you very, very much for this hour with us. We thank all the public who was watching us here. We thank again the network IR Marxism, the political, the IR department at the Catholic University, as well as Chutando a Escada podcast. Thank you very much. We'll be following now what's going to happen in the US, and we will translate the interview to put the subtitles for the Brazilian public, and maybe even publish it so that really can make it more public to others. Thank you so much, Leo, and
thank you all
for being here.
It's a pleasure to see you all. I miss you.
and thank you, Professor.
Keep up the
Hope you
great
get
work.
better. We're really hoping that you're doing better.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.